The subway car rumbled steadily along the worn tracks, its metallic frame vibrating with each bump and dip in the rail. Overhead, the dim fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting an uneven glow across the weary passengers scattered throughout the carriage. It was the late evening rush, just past 7, but for some reason, the train wasn't as crowded as it usually was. Maybe the cold drizzle outside had driven people to other forms of transportation. Or maybe it was just one of those rare nights when the city seemed to breathe a little slower. Inside the car, most people kept to themselves. Some stared blankly at their phones, the soft blue light reflecting on tired faces. Others gazed out of the rain-streaked windows, their thoughts miles away from the gray concrete landscape flashing by. A woman in a business suit scrolled through emails. A young couple whispered to each other, heads tilted close, sharing quiet laughter. An older man in paint-splattered overalls sat with his eyes closed, his head nodding in rhythm with the rocking train. And then there was him, sitting quietly near the rear of the carriage, close to the doors. An elderly black man, his posture slightly stooped but not defeated. His presence was subdued, yet unmistakably dignified. His clothes, however, told a different story. He wore an old brown trench coat, its fabric faded and fraying at the edges. His boots were scuffed and cracked, the soles threatening to part ways with the uppers if given half a chance. On his head was a knitted wool cap, dark gray and slightly lopsided, pulled low over thinning hair. His face, dark and deeply lined, was a map of years lived in battles, both literal and metaphorical, fought. In his lap, he held a simple leather satchel, his calloused fingers resting gently atop it, as if the bag carried something precious. Around his neck hung a silver pendant, the iconic eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps gleaming even under the sickly train lights. It was polished to a fine shine, almost reverently cared for, standing out against the faded hues of everything else he wore. 2 rows away, slouched across a pair of seats with his legs stretched into the aisle, sat another man. Ryan Maddox. Ryan was 30 years old, give or take a month. His head was shaved clean, his jawline sharp under a neatly trimmed beard. He was built like a linebacker, broad-shouldered and thick-muscled, the kind of physique that earned second glances and occasional stares. His tight white t-shirt clung to his chest and arms, leaving little to the imagination. A thick gold chain rested against his collarbone, gleaming whenever the lights stopped flickering long enough to catch the shine. He looked like a man who had everything figured out, or at least he liked to give off that impression. But tonight, Ryan was in a foul mood. Work had been brutal. His boss had ridden him hard all day, deadlines closing in like storm clouds. Traffic had been a nightmare on the way home. And now here he was, crammed into a subway car with a bunch of strangers, most of whom seemed content to ignore the fact that life was a relentless grind. He sighed heavily, glancing around, his restless gaze darting from face to face. Boredom gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. And then he saw the old man. Something about him, the tattered clothes, the worn-out boots, the way he clutched his bag, caught Ryan's attention. Maybe it was the stark contrast between them. Ryan, in his carefully curated image of strength and success. The old man, a relic of a life that had clearly known hardship. A crooked smirk tugged at Ryan's lips. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward just a bit, and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Hey, old-timer," he called out, his tone dripping with casual mockery. "You lose your way to the shelter or something?" A few heads turned. The couple stopped, whispering. The businesswoman paused her scrolling. But as was often the case in cities like this, no one intervened. They watched silently, already mentally stepping back into their private bubbles. The old man didn't respond at first. His gaze remained fixed ahead, unbothered, unmoved. Ryan wasn't having that. He pushed on. "Come on, man. Look at you. Walking around in those ragged clothes like you got nowhere to be. What's in a bag? Spare change? You busking for coins?" Still nothing from the old man. No anger, no shame, just a long, slow breath that left his cracked lips and fogged the air in front of him. Finally, the old man turned his head, just slightly, enough that Ryan could see his eyes. They were calm, steady, but tired. "Respect is free, young man," he said quietly. "You don't have to earn it to give it." Ryan chuckled. A short, dry sound. "Yeah? So's a trip to Goodwill. Maybe you ought to take one." He was about to toss out another jab when something caught his eye. The pendant. The Marine Corps emblem, shining silver against the old man's dark skin. Ryan's smirk faltered. His mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. His eyes locked onto that pendant like it was a lifeline. Or maybe an anchor. His father had one just like it. The breath caught in his throat. A sudden weight dropped into his stomach, heavy and cold. Memories hit him like the recoil of a rifle. 5 years since the funeral. 5 years since he'd stood over his father's casket and tucked that same kind of pendant into his folded hands. Ryan swallowed hard, his cocky bravado vanishing like smoke in a stiff wind. Where did you get that?" His voice was lower now. Hesitant, almost reverent. The old man's fingers brushed the pendant lightly, as if remembering its history through touch. "This," he said, his tone gentle. "It was a gift. From a brother. A man I served with. He gave it to me after we made it back home." Ryan's chest constricted. His father had served, too. 20 years in the Marines. He'd told Ryan stories when he was younger. Late nights at the kitchen table, over greasy takeout and cold beer, about the men he'd fought beside. One man, in particular, had come up often. His dad's best friend. His brother-in-arms. "What was his name?" Ryan asked, his throat dry, the words barely more than a whisper. The old man turned to him fully then, his tired eyes sharp and knowing. "Daniel Maddox," he said. Ryan's heart stopped. He could barely hear the noise of the train anymore, barely feel its rumble beneath his boots. That was his dad's name. The old man kept speaking, his voice thick with something Ryan couldn't name. "I knew it was you the moment I saw you." Ryan's mind reeled. The weight of his earlier words, his mocking tone, slammed into him with brutal force. He had ridiculed this man, judged him, dismissed him as nothing more than another face in the crowd. And he was his father's best friend. Maybe the man who had saved his dad's life more times than he could count. Shame clawed its way up Ryan's spine, settling in his chest like a stone. His jaw clenched. His fists tightened around the worn vinyl seat beneath him until his knuckles went white. The old man's eyes didn't waver. "I served with your father," he said quietly. "We were brothers in arms. 20 years, 3 tours. We swore we'd always have each other's backs." Ryan's voice cracked. "He told me about you. He used to tell me stories. About you." The old man's expression softened. "I used to tell stories about him, too." They sat there in silence for a long moment. The train rattled on through the dark, the lights flickering above them, and the city outside blurred into nothing. Ryan exhaled slowly. "I was a jerk," he admitted. "I'm sorry." The old man chuckled, low and warm. "Son, I've been called worse things in worse places. Takes more than a few words to rattle these bones." But Ryan shook his head. "Still, I was wrong." Another silence passed, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. "What's your name, boy?" the old man asked. "Ryan," he replied. "Ryan Maddox." The old man nodded. "Maddox. Just like him." He ran his fingers over the pendant again, his gaze distant. "Your father gave me this after our last tour. Said it was a reminder of what we'd survived, what we'd fought for." Ryan stared at the pendant, the symbol that had meant so much to his dad. He remembered seeing it in his father's hands late at night, his fingers tracing the same lines. His dad had never talked about the things he'd seen, but Ryan had always known there were stories behind his silence. And now, here was one of those stories, sitting in front of him. "You got somewhere to be?" Ryan asked, his voice hesitant. The old man arched a brow. "Why do you ask?" "I just thought," Ryan said, then stopped, gathering his nerve. "Maybe we could get a coffee. You could tell me more about him." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then a smile spread across his face. "I'd like that." The train screeched to a stop, and Ryan stood, waiting as the old man gathered his bag and pushed himself to his feet. Together, they stepped off the train and into the night. And for the first time in years, Ryan felt like he was carrying his father's memory not as a burden, but as an honor. And maybe, just maybe, he'd gained something his father would have been proud of: respect.